and thank you to Daliang and Beth and the center for this opportunity to speak to you. And also, I'm very grateful to Dr. Zhang for bringing me to China for the first time, to Beijing, to speak to the China Wisdom Engineering Association meeting, Fourth China Wisdom Symposium, because we are attempting to bridge between China's long history of thinking about wisdom and recent developments and efforts in the United States and abroad to think about wisdom. And as James mentioned, this work that I'm talking about today is supported by the John Templeton Foundation that are interested in the problem of big questions in human nature. But as James was alluding, and I will just give you my disclaimer up front, I'm not here to give you any wisdom, and I certainly don't have any. I am not a wisdom researcher by training. I'm a cognitive psychologist. So I study speech and language. I study processes of attention, processes of memory, learning, expectations, understanding. More recently, the role of sleep in learning and consolidation. And I do some work with economists on altruism, optimism, and temporal discounting, trying to understand the process of decision making. And that essentially sort of led me to issues about wisdom. Because the John Templeton Foundation had come to us at the University of Chicago as a well-known center for interdisciplinary research and asked my colleague John Cacioppo and I if we were interested in thinking about wisdom. The problem of wisdom in science is almost non-existent. I'll say something about it in a second. But what's interesting is that it's often confused with intelligence in the United States, in Europe. And I'm just put up here Binet's definition of intelligence. The reason Binet is important as a student and worker with Charcot, who is important for work on hypnosis, Binet is really one of the founders of the science of intelligence, who developed what essentially was the first systematic intelligence test. But the definition here of intelligence is really about a fundamental faculty for judgment. And in fact, the test itself doesn't test much about judgment. What judgment is an interesting question, but the notion of this more abstract concept of judgment rather than intelligence is interesting. If you look at the OED definition of intelligence, it's essentially the faculty of understanding. That itself is a pretty undefined term. In psychometrics, sort of the science of testing, what people have come to is the notion of intelligence can be quantified by looking across a number of diverse tests or skills and seeing what is the common variance between them. In other words, if you're good, and I'll just generalize here, if you're good at art and poetry, if you're good at assembly and solving puzzles and doing math and language, et cetera, and you're relatively good at all of those things, and there's something in common across them, that would be something that would be called psychometrically intelligence. Of course, the fact is that tests don't really work that way. When we move to the notion of wisdom, the OED, also a storehouse of knowledge for many of us, again comes up with this concept of judgment, judging rightly in matters of life and conduct. And this is, of course, derived from Aristotelian notions of phronesis. But in fact, it's more like Binet's view of intelligence. So the confusion, perhaps, that has emerged in the West between being smart and being wise is understandable because of the confusion that occurs in some of our sources. But judgment really goes beyond understanding, the OED definition of intelligence. Judgment also requires the balance of values. So when one has to take values into account along with the ability to analyze a problem and see how its components work together, then we're talking about something that's closer to wisdom. The John Templeton Foundation is very interested in the notion of the positive aspects of humanity, about how to make a better person, in some sense, how to strive for betterment. And they suggested developing a project that would support a new sort of round or generation of research in wisdom, perhaps to even start a field of wisdom science. After the start of our project in 2007, there was a paper published by Meeks and Jess, two neurologists who independently started thinking about wisdom. And it's interesting to see that other parts of the world of academia are starting to look at problems of wisdom. And Meeks and Jest listed a number of different characteristics that they considered important, some of which you could think of as foundational characteristics of wisdom, some of which might be thought of as hallmarks of its manifestation. So, for example, pro-social attitudes and behaviors. So the notion is that, and this is a debatable issue with philosophers, whether wisdom could ever be evil. Can you have an evil wise person? And in fact, the notion here is that no, you need pro-social positive attitudes. You need some notion of social connection, that you need to be able to have a pragmatic knowledge of life. So for example, one of the problems that Bob Sternberg, one of the major figures in intelligence research, one of the major problems that he's identified in intelligence research is the fact that it does not typically take into account pragmatic knowledge. So the ability to be smart in a village in Africa and the ability to be smart in the city of Chicago are different sets of abilities and not well measured. And if indeed there were something like intelligence that were core across a wide range of abilities, it should be the same thing, but it's not measured the same way. Wisdom then explicitly includes some notion of pragmatic knowledge of life, and therefore immediately socially contextualizes it to culture. As well, it includes emotional homeostasis. What that really means is the ability to regulate your own emotions, to downregulate impulsivity, maybe to increase empathic sensitivity to other people so that you can tell what other people are feeling instead of your own feelings. That it engages reflection and self-understanding. That's a little bit different. Intelligence never really talks about self-understanding and reflection. Long Christian traditions, Western traditions, emphasize the notion of self-reflection, but not so much a part of intelligence explicitly. Value relativism and tolerance, the ability to connect with other people in spite of differences in values, and acknowledgement of and dealing effectively with uncertainty and ambiguity. And I think that's important. We'll come back to this issue about what are the circumstances under which we can say societally that wisdom has been manifest. So why study wisdom at all? So we have these characters like Yoda from Star Wars, and that's supposed to be King Solomon according to someone's rendition, that are sort of cultural icons in the West of wisdom, whatever wisdom might be. That's how people think about it. When I asked students in my class on wisdom sort of to name somebody who's wise, aside from a couple of basketball coaches that I thought were dubious nominations, they would come up with figures of this sort. And these are cultural figures that essentially sort of elevate the notion of wisdom to a kind of standard that seems beyond the reach of the individual. So on the one hand, if you asked anybody, would you like to be a wise person? People would say, oh yeah, sure, that would be great. I'd love to be wise. But the fact is, it seems like a superpower. It doesn't seem like something you go out on the street and find any place. You can't go to school and get wise. And so the notion of wisdom seems mythical. It seems unreachable. And it's so complex and interdisciplinary, it has sort of defied simple study. If we think intelligence is a tough problem to study, wisdom is tougher even so because of the kinds of components that I just mentioned. Wisdom's also been long absent from public discourse. If you look back to the previous administration in the United States, the government seemed to encourage things like smartness and cleverness. And we can think of what it means to be smart or clever. And under the Bush administration, under the Clinton administration, we saw a number of examples of short-term optimization of corporate goals, and we would call those things smart and clever, but we didn't see a lot of wisdom. And in fact, the term wisdom started popping back up in the media with the first term of President Obama. And if you think about it for a second, you can also see, if you look back over the historical record of that administration, the nomination of Justice Sotomayor emphasized an aspect of empathy, which was an important aspect of judgment, but not of intelligence and analysis, which suggests a movement to the consideration of wisdom as important. So the idea of the Defining Wisdom Project, which I'll talk about, is essentially what Templeton wanted from the University of Chicago. They wanted us to lay the foundation for a field of wisdom science, to measure wisdom, to manipulate, at least understand the antecedents of wisdom. And at the time that they proposed this, there were really only a handful of wisdom researchers. And these wisdom researchers were essentially not, shall we say, getting a lot of traction on the problem. There was no broad recognition of the problem as a problem of scientific study, and there were no commonly adopted methods at all. And so some of the questions were to ask, does wisdom really exist? One of my favorite examples comes from Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. And in the book Collapse, he talks about the countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which share two sides of a common environment. And in Haiti, all of the trees were mined, if you will, out of existence as short-term resource use, leaving the country completely bare of trees. In the Dominican Republic, for various policy reasons, trees continued to exist. They were protected by policy. Now one could say, and the Dominican Republic as a consequence, in Jared Diamond's book, does better economically, socially, etc., because it has preserved an aspect of this natural resource. What's interesting is that the policy that gave rise to the existence of trees, the remaining trees being protected, was not, shall we say, a wise policy. It was not foresightful. It was perhaps idiosyncratic. And yet you look at this situation and you say, boy, that was wise. So the question of whether wisdom really exists or is simply just a societal judgment, ex post, about a set of circumstances where there is high uncertainty, high risk, and a good outcome, it might just be something that people say. It might not be something that exists as a process in the mind. And can wisdom really be studied scientifically? That was one of the issues being raised in this project. And is wisdom more like intelligence or something different, more like emotional intelligence rather than cognitive intelligence? And finally, one of the big issues was whether we could reach across the aisle, if you would, to span the difference in disciplines between the sciences and the humanities. The humanists in the United States, in the West, have studied wisdom textually, historically, philosophically, for a long time that scientists have ignored it. Can scientists use that kind of analytic thinking profitably to move forward? Now, the work on wisdom in psychology by Ardelt and Sternberg and Baltus and so forth essentially did think that wisdom was a property of people, did not cast it off as a kind of societal judgment, and essentially treats it as a kind of expertise, a kind of knowledge that can be gained by experience. Monica Ardelt is a clinical psychologist. It's about the integration of cognitive, reflective, and emotional abilities in wisdom, trying to integrate the whole person. And Sternberg talks about, as he often does in other circumstances, that wisdom emerges from an interaction of a person, a task, and a situation. In other words, it's not simply inherent in the person, but it may be mobilized out of a confluence of different circumstances. So one of the problems in developing a field of wisdom or defining wisdom, wisdom science, is to measure wisdom. How do you measure it? I mean, you can't take a yardstick to it. You can't take an IQ test to it at this point in time. A lot of what I've listed here are simply some of the different ways in which some of these psychologists have taken. One is just to ask people, what is wisdom? But that gives us a folk psychology of wisdom. What people believe about Yoda and King Solomon may not inform us scientifically in a way that's useful. Baltus used hypothetical dilemmas. I'll show you one in a second. Hypothetical dilemmas where people were asked to just reason about real life situations. Ardelt used more personal situations, having people sort of strive to find in their own experience things that would be examples. But you could use comparison populations, find the wisest people, judges, and the less wise, prison populations, and compare them on various kinds of dimensions of intellectual, affective, and social functioning. You could look at the distribution in a single population, find the tails of the distribution, who's at the top and who's at the bottom if you had the right kind of instruments. Can you define a scale of wisdom, in other words? So this is an example of one of the kinds of little hypotheticals that is used Essentially, the problem is a 15-year-old girl wants to get married, and what should she do? What should she consider? People are given a problem like that. It's stated down here. And then essentially they're asked for some answers. And so one person who gets a low score on wisdom says, no, no way, marrying at 15 would be wrong. It's not possible, et cetera, et cetera. Notice that it's a very confined, limited, focused answer. And it doesn't ask any questions about the girl or her circumstances. The high score actually gets a different kind of perspective. Does she have a terminal illness? Is there reason for this? What is her circumstances? What culture does she come from, et cetera? So the notion of this kind of measurement, which is very difficult to do, by the way, scoring these kinds of things is very difficult. This is not going to be rocket science. This is going to be a different kind of science. Scoring these is very difficult, but at least it gives you a sense that something like this, where it's focused on making a judgment that is judgmental as opposed to kind of finding the facts on the ground and understanding the depth and dimensions of a situation, may be something that allows us to characterize wisdom. The Defining Wisdom project goals were to provide $2 million of research support to 20 junior faculty, scholars and scientists around the world to study wisdom, and to foster amongst these awardees an interdisciplinary cooperation to try to develop new approaches to wisdom research, and to develop a field that spans disciplines ultimately. And so the aspects of this part were managed in a kind of National Institute of Health type granting process. I won't go into the details, I'll skip over them in a second. But what's important is the notion of trying to reach across disciplines through a series of quarterly phone conversations that were planned, as well as annual face-to-face meetings that allowed a large group of researchers to talk together about fundamental questions, even though they came from different perspectives. In order to carry this out, we essentially had a group called the Wisdom Council that was responsible for making the final decisions on the awards. We solicited letters of intent. I'll say something more about that in a second. We used them to identify 40 candidates for full proposals. We ultimately selected 20 grantees for the $2 million, funding 2-year projects, and developed a website for communications and community. That website, wisdomresearch.org, still exists today. It's been continued. And the final product of this would be a book. It turns out that, we don't need to look at this. So the Wisdom Council was largely made up of people from the University of Chicago. You can see representatives from the psychology department, the Div School, Mark Hansen from social sciences, Ron Thisted from health studies, Jonathan Lear, a philosopher, and then some people around the country with broadly different perspectives as well. So in terms of the solicitation of letters of intent, this simply gives the statistics, but we sent out thousands and thousands of solicitations worldwide in an attempt to garner across disciplines as broadly as possible a set of letters of intent that would represent interest in wisdom research. And the selection criteria were basically these as stated. The idea in a nutshell of these criteria is to try to find those projects themselves as defined which would contribute to the advancement of wisdom science, to move the field forward, to define a field, if you will, to bring scientific methods to bear on the problem, and to see whether the proposed research could be carried out in the amount of time available, but also to look for researchers capable of carrying out this kind of project. We received 631 letters of intent. Only 517 of the letters were actually really eligible letters of intent, but we were stunned. We expected maybe to get 20 or 30 people interested in wisdom, and here from around the world we received over 500 letters of intent to do research on this project. We were able to use a peer review process to reduce that to 120. The 120 letters of intent were reviewed directly by the council, and then 40 finalists were selected. This shows a breakdown of the interests across fields. And what you see is that, represented here, the largest group was psychologists, human development, social work, and neuroscience, 21% of the letters of intent, 13% from philosophy. So immediately there's almost a balance of power there between the humanities and social sciences. Sociology, education, government, political science, religious studies, only 1% from music, biology, and computer science, but still some of these were quite interesting. The geographic distribution of interest and wisdom was surprising to us. Almost 80% from North America, next largest 15% from Europe, and we did not essentially draw from Asia, South and Central America, and Africa as we had hoped we might. In other words, although we wanted broad international appeal, unfortunately the distribution of letters of intent was largely confined to North America, with Europe following. The finalists roughly mirrored the distribution of fields in the letter of intent. We did include a sampling of some of the smaller fields in order to make sure that there was broad representation. So we had people in the finalist group from music, urban planning, computer science, and biology. Ultimately, not all of these were funded, but they were brought in essentially to compete after their full proposals in small groups, where each proposal was actually given only 5 minutes to present and defend their proposal. But the interaction among the groups was one of the things that was being examined, as well as how well they could answer questions about their work. So 23 grants were awarded, and I just want to mention a few of the projects because I think they're kind of interesting. Randall McNeil, for example, from classics. So he was studying classic Greek figures like Oedipus and Achilles and trying to understand the failure of wisdom. In other words, to develop a model of wisdom, to understand wisdom not by its success, not looking at King Solomon, but looking at cases where, for example, a ruler perhaps loves the idea of a country more than, for example, the people within it or those that he's close to. The failures of wisdom, where does wisdom break down? Gene Gordon was very interested in the notion of language and wisdom. So a lot of the measures of wisdom depend on the way you talk about wisdom. A lot of what we think about in wisdom is not just the decision that is made, but the way the decision is conveyed. And so she looked at how aging affects language use. One of the things we think about is we associate aging with wisdom. Older people are wiser. However, older people actually have changes in the ability to use working memory and some aspects of syntax. And so the question was whether the perception of wisdom might change in a way that was adverse to the way we think about wisdom in aging, in real aging. Ankur Gupta is the one computer that was included, and he looked at the notion of less is more. So the notion that more knowledge should equal wisdom was a kind of premise of a lot of work on database, large data set analyses. It's the premise of a lot of artificial intelligence. And Gupta was approaching the notion that in some cases, selection is the key to wisdom. Finding the right things to compress, not just taking hold of everything. Shabnam Musavi from the Max Planck Institute was studying the notion of heuristic wisdom. So we think about wisdom as a very complex process, but her collaborator, Gerd Gigerenzer, has done a lot of work on the development of decision heuristics. For example, if I ask you about the largest, which of two cities in Germany, for example, is the larger, if you know one has a soccer team, it's a good heuristic to figuring out the larger. You don't have to know the population. So that kind of approach, finding simple rules that solve very complex problems, is what Shabnam was studying. Sandil Mulanathan at Harvard, an economist who worked with Dick Thaler and Danny Kahneman, was interested in the notion of institutional wisdom. And what is institutional wisdom? Well, in the book Nudge by Sunstein and Thaler, they talk about the fact that certain policies can produce outcomes that are better than other policies in certain kinds of ways. The idea that Mulanathan was interested in is how do we make a wise institution if, for example, no individual in the institution is wise? Is that possible? And then finally, I'll just mention Neil Tsutsui, a biologist studying ants at Berkeley. And we might think, well, how could ants have wisdom? They barely have a brain. Well, they do have a brain and a nervous system. But what was interesting about this project was the notion that ants carry social information back to their nest. So for example, when one ant meets an ant from a different nest, the nature of their interaction as conflict or cooperation can be carried back pheromonally and communicated to the entire nest, and therefore conditions future behavior when an ant from that nest meets one of the other. So these projects, you can see, span history, internal medicine, law, philosophy, political science, psychology, and a large number in psychology that were reflective of the increase in interest. Some of these are in neuroscience, looking at moral decision-making and the brain responses during moral decision-making. The project was extremely productive. 5 books were published during the term of the project. By 2011, another 10 books were in preparation. 26 peer-reviewed articles were published with 34 more in preparation. 12 chapters published, 90 presentations, 4 new courses on wisdom were taught. So on the one hand, the productivity of the project was substantial. On the other hand, perhaps it may not have moved wisdom science farther as one might have hoped. In order to try to grapple with some of the problems of having 23 PIs, principal investigators, talk to each other on the phone on a quarterly basis to have productive conversations, the group decided that there was not enough time in any 1.5-hour conversation to cover all the topics. So they formed small groups to study things like ancient concepts. And one of the outcomes of that particular group was to look at the Aristotelian distinction between phronesis and Sophia. And in that distinction, Aristotle focused on the notion of practical wisdom, the wisdom of everyday life, eudaimonia, and how we improve the flourishing of our human life, and what that's like, versus something called Sophia, which seemed to be a more generic or characteristic form of wisdom. And one of the things that this group particularly focused on is that almost every project that was being funded was on phronesis. And perhaps if we make progress on a science of wisdom, it will be in terms of practical wisdom at the outset in order to understand wisdom. A group on research methods discussed a number of approaches to how one could study wisdom profitably, using computer games, using mathematical models, etc. And in fact, from that, a number of outcomes did emerge. For example, this shows something called a wisdom map that came from that group. The idea is to try to characterize the elements of wisdom, and this diagram was used to make each of the 23 projects comparable. In other words, if we think about wisdom inherent in an individual, this block diagram here represents an individual who might or might not be wise, interacting with other individuals. There's a situation before the interactions take place. There are actions taken place by this wise, purportedly wise individual, actions taken by these other folks, collective action and situation after, that one can characterize elements of wisdom that inhere in an individual, elements that inhere in the situation, and elements that are consequences of the situation. So from that project, there actually were more questions than answers. Perhaps that's always the way in academia. And these are some of the questions that arose from those group discussions. Is there one wisdom or many? For example, is there a wisdom of the body? So in many disciplines and many cultures, one can think of your body knowing things even before your mind does. But how is that different from the wisdom of explicit decision-making? Should we talk about these as one kind of wisdom or different? Does wisdom depend on age or experience? The classical notion, the notion that Paul Baltus, one of the wisdom researchers from Germany who preceded the project, he thought that age was important, but he didn't make clear what process would give rise to wisdom from age. The notion of experience seemed to be the more important consideration. In fact, that suggests almost anybody could become a little wiser. And indeed, that's the notion that, that you see down here in terms of is wisdom relative. In other words, can we become a little bit wiser? Or do you have to be wise or not wise? And is there wisdom in the individual or simply ex post judgments by society? I think there was pretty good agreement in the group that we are seeing examples of wisdom in both circumstances. In other words, there are many times society judges something to be wise, but whether that really included real wise decision making or not is independent of the issue that there are in fact wise individuals. And one of the more interesting questions came from Neil Tsutsui and the conflict with some of the philosophers. Some philosophers disagreed with Aristotle. Aristotle did think that even lower animals could be wise, that they have practical wisdom. But what was important from this was whether we could use animal models of wisdom. So for example, we see things like tool use in the crow. We see animals becoming innovative and creative. Can we learn from simplified models by taking the elements of wisdom and studying them independent of the whole? So in essence, some of the conclusions of defining wisdom, that wisdom is not intrinsic to a particular act, but it's an act in a context. That is, the way a particular behavior or decision is viewed depends on the context in which it occurs, in the culture in which it occurs. That wisdom is not necessarily intrinsic to a person. What behaviors may be wise in one context, again, may be and judged foolish elsewhere. Essentially, one of the most important conclusions, I think, of this project was that perhaps wisdom can be taught. In other words, the notion that we can provide structured experiences to individuals, and that those structured experiences may lead to an increase in wisdom. If you believe that wisdom is relative, that is, you can move up on the scale of wisdom, and you believe that wisdom is a consequence of specific experiences, then in principle one could provide specific kinds of experiences and move people up on the wisdom scale. So this essentially just outlines some of the conditions under which society would make judgments about wisdom. Something is not judged to be wise if there's no risk involved. Something is not judged to be wise if it's a sure thing. If there's no wisdom ever in a circumstance where someone has no chance to be wrong, etc. So out of this project, the Defining Wisdom project, a new project has now emerged at the University of Chicago. One of the problems among in the prior project, in Defining Wisdom project, is that with 23 different independent investigators, all going off in their own directions, there was no evidence of a coherent movement of wisdom in a particular direction, of wisdom science, of wisdom research. So our understanding was not necessarily strongly advanced in one direction. So the current project, which is supported by the Templeton Foundation, is essentially funding 6 research projects at the University of Chicago among a group of investigators who are interacting specifically on particular research topics. And the research topics that are focused on are expertise and experience and wisdom. Expertise because one of the interesting shortcomings of the Defining Wisdom project had to do with the notion that suppose you found a group of judges and you asked those judges, who is the wisest judge you know? Who are they going to nominate? Richard Posner at the University of Chicago, Antonin Scalia. It's hard to know, but once they've nominated somebody, it turns out that when you go to that person and say, so tell us about being wise, they say, what, me wise? So given that an aspect of wisdom may have inherent in it some aspect of humility, it's very hard to find wise people that way. But it's also important to understand what the relationship is between domain-specific knowledge, expertise, and wisdom. In other words, are all people who are experts in a field also wise? It seems unlikely. And so the question of expertise and wisdom seems like a fundamentally interesting one. And at the same time, how you got there, where you get to that expertise and where you get to wisdom through a set of experiences is a critical question. So the Chicago Wisdom Research Projects, 3 of the projects are on expertise and wisdom. One is specifically on the development of medical empathy and wisdom. One is on economic expertise and wisdom. One is on first versus second language in wisdom. One reason that that's important is it suggests the following. So we typically think of people as being expert in their first language, and that expertise ought to be something that makes them a better negotiator, makes them a better problem solver, a better thinker. But it turns out that in your second language, you have a certain kind of distance from the message that you're conveying. You have a distance from the form of the conveyance of that message. That distance gives you instantaneously gives you a little bit of self-regulation. You step back from being impulsive. You step back from being emotional. And so this particular project is interested in the notion that perhaps you can be a little bit wiser in your second language than your first language. And if so, what does that tell us about wisdom? The last three projects have to do with the kinds of experiences that lead to wisdom. And indeed, this project is about specific language using, for example, metaphor might lead to insights, might lead to understandings, might lead to a kind of broader conception of a problem than, say, using literal language. In this project, Developing Insight, the question is what actually leads to insights? Many people associate insights, forming connections between disparate things that aren't obvious to everyone, as a part of wisdom. And so this looks at the kinds of experiences that lead to insight. And then somatic and mental training. This is trying to look at the notion of the wisdom of the body and whether, in fact, training your body involves aspects of training your mind. And in doing so, in training your mind, are we seeing changes in wisdom? So just briefly, I'm going to mention this one project and I'll skip over the other two because I see we're running short on time. But the notion of expertise is a very interesting one. So expertise in medical settings leads to a kind of distancing from the patient. If you have deep empathy for your patient and you're holding a scalpel in your hand, how do you insert the scalpel into the patient? How do you cause your patient pain to relocate a dislocated shoulder? So the question of medical empathy is an interesting one because in Jean de Setty's work, he's published a paper in Current Biology which essentially shows that when you look at physicians who are viewing images of people who are getting stuck with a needle versus rubbed with a Q-tip, that the ratings of pain and unpleasantness essentially show differences between physicians and controls. In other words, the physicians do not perceive a situation as painful as someone who is not a trained medical person. But furthermore, there are changes in brain activity. Right here is the area called the anterior insula, which is a part of your brain which responds when you're in pain. If you have pain in your gut, pain on your skin, and you see this activity also in the anterior cingulate, a region that's involved in aspects of upset and distress. Well, notice that for physicians, there's a great reduction in activity in these regions and in this region. In other words, the physicians have down-regulated, self-homeostatically regulated their response to the pain of another person. That allows them to administer treatment, but it actually has a downside. It has a downside that works against wisdom. And the downside is that if you are now distanced from your patient, your ability to understand their concerns, the way they're expressing themselves, is reduced. So that's a problem. It turns out to be a serious problem in medical settings. For patients who are talking about their history, they don't actually report their history as a series of clear facts to be understood like a checklist. Doctors need to be able to understand the narrative that is being presented by the patient. And that narrative is often requiring some kind of empathy. And it's not just in the facts of the situation. So on the one hand, there's a benefit to down-regulating empathic response, but it may work against wisdom to understanding the problems of the patient. And so Jean is now studying classes of medical students as they go through medical school, taking genetic information, taking a number of subjective ratings, doing brain scans to try to understand how their brains change as a function of medical training. I'm going to skip over this part because we're running out of time. But essentially what I wanted to sort of leave you with is the thinking that we have now as a consequence of some of the work that's just started at the University of Chicago, the interactions with philosophers. So one notion is, what are the foundations of wisdom that we can study? So one aspect of, for example, the medical situation is that doctors themselves become a little bit, in distancing themselves from their patients, they view themselves as slightly above their patients. And so perhaps they don't listen to them with open ears. One of the issues that arises in terms of expertise is the notion of epistemic humility. Epistemic humility is an interesting concept because it means you realize, it doesn't mean you are self-effacing, oh no, I don't know anything. What you realize is that in spite of all the things you do know, in spite of the magnitude of your expertise, there is so much more to learn. There is a lot more out there. And that leads you to be more open to other people's values. It leads you open to self-reflection. The person who knows everything doesn't need to reflect much. The person who has epistemic humility may engage in self-reflection. Virtue motivation may be one of the underlying motivations, underlying foundations. So virtue motivation is important for a pro-social drive. Generosity, honesty, trust, gratitude. These are things that travel with wisdom typically, at least according to some philosophers, but understanding their foundations, wanting to connect to other people as opposed to not wanting to connect to other people. That may be critical to the development of wisdom. The willingness to engage intellectual struggle, something in the West that we have disconsidered for a long time as, oh, the person who's working hard on a problem and struggling with it, they're maybe not so bright. The notion of struggle is the willingness to engage and to engage seriously. This is something that some academics do and other academics may not do, but for the wise person it must be perhaps part of the problem. And then what it takes to nurture insight. So understanding the foundations of insight, where it comes from, what it develops from, and how it plays a role in wisdom. And these are some of the issues that across the 6 projects we're starting to focus on. So in terms of this particular project, one of the goals is really to advance towards some kind of field of wisdom science, that there would be annual international meetings sharing wisdom research findings, a society to support this kind of wisdom research, a journal that would be focused on it, or we would develop perhaps a center at the University of Chicago, which is known for interdisciplinarity and the willingness to cross disciplinary boundaries and develop interactions. That would be a center that would attract scholars and scientists from around the world to share their information and knowledge about wisdom and to think about it. And perhaps to influence general education in the United States and in the West and in the East, to incorporate aspects of wisdom, to think about wisdom more broadly, and to influence professional education as well. Thank you.